Hello, students, and welcome back to the Matthew Schoen Sociology Experience. This episode is being filmed in my panic room over the weekend. Today, I want to set the tone for a larger discussion and hopefully a theme that I anticipate being a big part of many of your paper topics, and that is if the issue we have cared the most about over the last several weeks is opportunity structures. And we accept that at least part, and likely a big part, of those opportunity structures are determined at the neighborhood level. What happens when you move people? What happens when people move from a low opportunity neighborhood to a high opportunity neighborhood? And that means today I'm going to be discussing and laying out the findings of a landmark urban sociology natural experiment called Moving to Opportunity, okay? In the way of announcements, before I get started on that, you will know from the syllabus and from my announcements, my emails, that on Friday of this week, so March 27th, you'll be submitting your data table to me. So I gave you in the last video a visual rundown. I've given you the instruction sheet on what your data table should look like. And for all of you, it's going to be slightly different. It's going to be specific to your city or to neighborhoods and counties if I've encouraged you to look at that. But do look at this as your opportunity to connect the conceptual arguments you want to make to the quantitative evidence for the existence of that at the local level. Okay, so I'm more than happy to answer questions about that as this week goes on. For now, let's talk about moving to opportunity. Okay, so here's my agenda for this video here. I first would like to engage and lay out a concept that I personally have always been very interested in, and that's called neighborhood effects. I'll define that in just a moment. Then I will describe what the Moving to Opportunity experiment looked like and how it was implemented. And finally, we will actually look at the outcomes of that study, because we've had a lot of research at the sociological and economic level as to what has actually happened to people and to individuals who did participate ultimately in that study. Okay, so let's get to it. Neighborhood effects, I'm going to say this as clearly as I can. Neighborhood effects refer to the influence on your life of living in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty over and above the influence of all your human capital characteristics and personal background. Okay, so we know that if you live in a high poverty neighborhood, then you are likely to be poor yourself. That's why it's a high poverty neighborhood. The people there are poor. Here's the question. Are you poor because you live in that poor neighborhood? Or do you live in that poor neighborhood because you yourself are poor as a result of other reasons? Okay, so is it because you lack even a high school degree and you lack skills that are well rewarded by the labor market? Is that maybe what's driving you to have no other choice but to live in a high poverty and a neighborhood of concentrated poverty? So put another way, what's the effect of living in that neighborhood independent of your personal background? What does the neighborhood actually do? How does the neighborhood actually matter for your personal life chances? Okay. Untangling those two things is very statistically difficult. So if we look at the conceptual model here, what are the neighborhood macro links? Here, the macro effect is everything we've been talking about, skills mismatch, spatial mismatch, segregation, right? All these things, the historical discrimination factors. That's what's meant by macro, right? Like, so you personally, it's not like you were in control of whether your group was discriminated against in the housing market. It's not like you were personally in control of whether or not incarceration and legal policy put your group at such a high likelihood of going to prison. It's not your responsibility. Like, it's not you were not in control of the fact that industrial jobs and jobs that did not require a college degree but still offered a middle class pathway disappeared from your neighborhood. But personally speaking, I can then look and say, all right, your lack of a high school degree and your criminal record, let's say, are personal attributes that are going to make your likelihood of being in poverty much higher throughout the rest of your life. So that's what's meant. And those last couple things that I said, that's the micro link. Okay. So let's start with point one on this conceptual flow chart. We start with neighborhood structure and culture, and that neighborhood existed before you ever personally lived in it, before I ever personally lived in it. So what that does then is the contextual nature of the neighborhood creates well, as we see on the graph here, propensity and capacity. Okay, what do you have the capacity to accomplish? What are you likely to accomplish? And how are you likely to perceive the society around you, right? The way I perceived my society growing up, I think, was very different from how the young men in that documentary about Los Angeles street gangs perceived their neighborhood. Okay. And it's not hard to see where that came from. It came from the neighborhood, right? What did I see around me growing up, and what did I see as possible and impossible choices in my own life? So that neighborhood context creates a sort of opportunity structure. But then number two here at the individual level, I personally make choices, and those choices are mine, right? Those choices are mine, even though they're influenced by the contextual level. Individually, the choices that I make are something that have to matter and have to be taken seriously in a sociological way. Flow arrow number three is what we call an emergent property, because if enough people have their actions constrained and filtered in a very specific direction, that creates rates of social behavior, right? Rates of criminality, rates of joblessness, rates of educational attainment. And those are the outcomes that we see, but it's very difficult to understand whether that's the 1, 2, 3 pathway. I just tried to point at the screen with my finger. The 1, 2, 3 pathway here, from contextual to individual decisions to emergent properties, or whether it's happening at the also at the community level. Most of us would argue that yes, neighborhoods have an effect, but disentangling that statistically and trying to understand what is the effect over and above individual choice is statistically very, very difficult, but perhaps not impossible. We know that people of a certain background tend to be most likely to live in areas of concentrated poverty. What if we could take that individual choice out of it? What if we could take that selection mechanism out of it? Okay, so here is the moving to opportunity question. If the problem is concentrated disadvantage, and I think the majority of my students are willing to come in on this writ large, that is a serious problem at the social level, why not just move people to a better area? Put another way, the neighborhood effect can be theorized to be what happens to people once they've been removed from that area of concentrated poverty, and everything that happens after that, because their personal characteristics have not changed, everything that happens after that is likely a result of the better neighborhood. Essentially, you can subtract it right off of the equation and be left with just the neighborhood effect. We can disentangle individual effects from neighborhood effects, okay? And that's the key research question here. Moving to opportunity was a landmark study that was it was a landmark study that was conducted one round in the 1990s, another round in the 2000s, and through the better part of this most recent decade, we've been gathering data from what happened to these people in these households over their life course. So we have about 30 years of data, of experimental data on this. Does changing the place of residence affect the well-being of both children and adults? Does it better their labor market outcomes? Does it better their exposure to antisocial practices? Does it better their ability to improve their lives individually? Okay, what's the neighborhood effect there? The research design is beautifully simple here. If you took any type of class on like experimental methods, or you remember biology class, chemistry class, things that really go into these scientific experiments, you'll remember that you always have to have at least two groups in an experiment. an experimental group, and a control group. Okay? So I'm actually going to start with the control. I'm going to start with the experimental group here. People who participated in moving to opportunity originally in the 1990s were filtered into one of three groups. The first was called the low poverty experimental group. That group was given a voucher that they could use to pay their rent. And this was federally funded and backed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, by HUD, which Ben Carson weirdly is fucking in control of at this point. And so the thing that made this different, though, the thing that made this a real experimental thing, was that they could only use that voucher to move to a neighborhood that was defined as being low poverty, quote unquote. A low poverty neighborhood was one in which fewer than 33% of the population was living in poverty. Okay. Now, as it turns out, these vouchers sometimes got accepted in high poverty neighborhoods. It was hard to enforce this once it was given to people, but by and large, that is something that was honored. It was only allowed to be used in a low poverty neighborhood. So that's the group that, quote unquote, moved to opportunity. Hence the name of the study, Moving to Opportunity. Now, there was a type of interim control group called the Section 8 group. Now, if you heard of Section 8, you likely understand it as a form of welfare. Section 8 was the type of housing voucher that existed previously. It gave low-income households rent assistance, but they could use it anywhere. And it turns out the only places that typically did accept Section 8 renters and Section 8 vouchers were overwhelmingly places that were high poverty to begin with anyway. So that was kind of the one of the big puzzles here is, yes, we could help people with rent, but it was through Section 8, almost always keeping people in areas of concentrated poverty. And then finally, the control group, they were given nothing, which, that sucks for you because you just got given nothing, but it's important to see that as the baseline comparison. People that have no housing assistance and people that have that continue to live in high poverty areas. All right. And now this happened in 5 cities throughout America: Baltimore, Maryland, Boston, Massachusetts, Chicago, Illinois, Los Angeles, California, and New York City. These were the 5 settings, and several thousand households and tens of thousands of people were part of this study, either by moving to a low income, to a low poverty area, moving to a high poverty area through Section 8, or not moving at all. And if they did move, that was just because that was what they chose to do. Just as an aside here, in the New York City area, I do remember when I was a kid in the late 90s and a teenager in the early 2000s, I remember hearing about this a little bit. There were articles in the newspaper. The New York Times was covering it. And one of the neighborhoods that was designated as a place to move to opportunity was actually in my hometown of Yonkers, New York, believe it or not, where I know that the Section 8 group was put in a part of the South Bronx, and several of the experimental people ended up either in the North Bronx, in the Wakefield section of the Bronx, if you're familiar with that at all, and parts of South Yonkers, where the poverty rates were lower than they were in parts of Brooklyn or parts of Upper Manhattan. So those were the 5 cities. This makes it something of a national study, but it's probably not entirely representative of the country, because it is only five cities. However, what Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, LA, and New York City all have in common is that they were known for having high rates of concentrated poverty. New York City a little less so than the other 4. But nevertheless, you are talking about neighborhoods with very high poverty rates scattered throughout these 5 cities. Okay, so we're going to take people who live in a very poor part of Chicago and move them to a neighborhood of low poverty in Chicago and see what happens to them. Same thing in Boston, same thing in Baltimore, same thing in Los Angeles, same thing in New York City. And then look at the data. All right. So what I want to do now is go through the findings here. This is going to require me to go through several graphs here that have been demonstrated to be statistically significant. What you're going to see on all of these, the yellow bar, that's the control mean, although some of these will be presented as z-scores, which I know some of the students in this class from one of my other classes totally know what a z-score is. I'll explain that briefly once that becomes an issue on a later graph. But for now, you want to be comparing the yellow bar, which is the mean at the control group, the group that was given absolutely nothing, and the red bar, which is LPV, or low poverty voucher group. That's the group we really care about. So the initial finding is, hey, did this work in that people did move to a lower poverty neighborhood? And on that note, yes, that absolutely did happen. So the census tract poverty rate, the average poverty rate for the control group was 45%. That is 45% of the people living in those neighborhoods for the control group that got nothing given to them were living in poverty. 45%. Now, for the low poverty voucher group, my experimental group, that poverty rate declined to 33% on average. So still, I would say that's still a fairly high poverty neighborhood. That's not, your wealthy suburb out in Oakland County or something, but that's a noticeable decline. That's a very noticeable decline in the poverty rate. As for the percentage of the census tract, the percentage of people living in a census tract of over 30% poverty, which is often used as the metric for high poverty areas, 87% in the control group. That is to say, 87% of the control group households lived in an area, in a neighborhood, with a poverty rate above 30%. That was only 52% for the low poverty voucher group. So it's not like we eliminated exposure to poverty, but we have reduced it pretty seriously through this experiment. And in terms of the quality of what's a better neighborhood, quote unquote, well, we've talked about crime, we've talked about safety, and we've talked about drugs in the previous week. The group in the percentage of people who reported seeing either illicit drugs being sold or used, 46% for the control group. So almost 1 out of every 2 people saw that in the high poverty neighborhoods that they remained in, whereas the experimental group value was only 34%. So from about 1 out of every 2 to a little more than 1 out of every 3. The exposure to drugs did appear to go down. In terms of crime victimization, we did see a noticeable and significant decline there as well. 20% of the high poverty control group was reported being a victim of a crime, as opposed to only 17% of people in the experimental group becoming a victim of a crime. And also feelings of safety increased, probably because there was less victimization occurring and there was less illicit drug use or drug dealing occurring in the neighborhood. Only 15% of the low poverty group said they felt unsafe during the day. Compare that to about 25% in the control group. And we can see that there's an increase in safety, an increase in perception of safety, and a decrease of the exposure to drugs. So right off the bat, I might look at this and say, yeah, the neighborhood probably was exhibiting better characteristics for the impoverished households that were then moved to this area. However, if we try to link that to labor market outcomes, it's a little bit more sobering of a finding. There's absolutely no evidence that people were more or less likely to be working. So in these control group neighborhoods, 55% were either not working, or were on TANF, which TANF, I think I've said this in class, TANF stands for Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. It's what is most commonly referenced as welfare, although I don't want to go down this rabbit hole again because I've said it a bunch of times in class. There's no such thing as welfare. You don't sign up for welfare. You sign up for one of a number of social programs depending on your eligibility to get into that. But that's quote unquote what we think of as welfare whenever we are using that term. So 55% not working or on TANF in the control group and 53% not working or on TANF in the low poverty voucher group. Not a big difference there. Slight decline, but it does appear that moving to these better neighborhoods didn't make people any more likely to be working or not. We did see a slight bettering of people's psychological distress scores. So you'll notice here that these bars, one of these is positive, one of these is negative. For a variety of reasons I don't want to go into right now, the authors of this study express these as Z-scores. Z-scores, essentially all they are is they transition the unit to that of a standard deviation. So if you have a negative Z-score, that means the outcome is below the average. And if you have a positive Z-score, it means that you have an outcome that is above the mean or above the average. So listen very carefully here because this is important. People in the control group had psychological distress scores 0.05 units, standard deviation units, above the mean of everybody. People in the low poverty neighborhoods had psychological distress scores 0.04 units below the mean. So under the mean, they got less psychologically distressed. Seems good to me. However, when I look at fair or the people that are in fair or poor health, not a huge impact there. And in fact, it may have gotten a little bit worse. People in the control group, 33% had either fair or poor health. So like not in good or excellent health is really what we're looking at here. And 35% in the low poverty voucher group. So moving the neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean that the effect on your body of the neighborhood over a very long period of time is just magically erased, especially if you factor in a lifetime of smoking sometimes or a lifetime of poor nutrition. That just doesn't go away. However, we did see a slight decrease in obesity rates. Now, I don't want to go too far into this because I have been told that by many people in the kinesiology department that BMI, body mass index, is not a great way to talk about health. But hey, it's what the authors cited here. So people who were classified as obese with a body mass index of greater than or equal to 30 declined from 47% in the control group to 42% in the low poverty voucher group. So that was a group that one might say had access to perhaps better, like more of an ability to exercise and walk around. I'm not quite sure. That's speculative. But it is showing that in these low poverty neighborhoods, they had access to better nutrition and they had access to more food and grocery options. And that probably did have some type of small effect, even though 47% to 42% is not a massive decrease. It is still a statistically significant finding and one that might, be something that you could build off of. Now, in terms of schools, because what the researchers cared the most about, even though this wasn't explicitly said, they've said off the record many times that what they really cared about was children, and we're right to do that. We are right to really care about the well-being of children. Here's a finding that is going to come up over and over again with movement to opportunity. Girls improved, whereas boys generally were damaged by this move. That's going to come up a lot. So let's take a look at schooling in terms of math proficiency and reading proficiency. So starting over here with the first collection of bars here, comparing the yellow to the red, people were, and again, we are now expressing these as once again as Z-scores, okay? So there was a real decrease there. Males in the control group were 0.05 standard deviations below the mean in math attainment, whereas those in the low poverty voucher group actually did worse than those that stayed in very high poverty neighborhoods. Whereas with girls generally did better than boys, and the girls in the low poverty neighborhoods did better than those in the high poverty neighborhoods. neighborhoods. So it seems it's just interesting how that's been kind of flipped around. Female math scores in the low poverty voucher group went up and did better than not just the boys, but did better than the girls that were in these low poverty or in these high poverty neighborhoods. Then if I look at male reading, it doesn't seem like there's an effect at all. Both of these are negative 0.1. And I can see that from the control group and the low poverty voucher group. Girls' reading proficiency, again, better than the boys and better for the experimental group as compared to the control group. So within schools, it seems that girls definitely got a benefit from this. The boys, if anything, did worse than they would have if they had never actually moved. And that will become a theme with many other elements of the neighborhood. It seems that if we just look at girls, that's all you're seeing on this graph here is just for the girls. Much less distressed and displayed generally safer behavior. So let's look at the far left here. We're looking at Z-scores again. The psychological distress scores as measured in standard deviation units. Those in high poverty neighborhoods, the control group, were 0.27 units greater than average on psychological distress scores. But for those that this is a small effect, but for those in the low poverty voucher groups, 0.02 standard deviations below the mean on psychological distress scores. So they did better. They were less psychologically distressed than whatever the average was of everybody thrown together. Now, if we look at risk-taking behaviors and unsafe behaviors, something like using marijuana in the last 30 days, I can see that 13% in high poverty neighborhoods did that. This is among the girls, only 7% in low poverty neighborhoods. We look at behavioral problems index, right? What percentage of people had severe behavioral problems? 24% in the control group, 23% in the low poverty group. So almost no effect there. But the number of lifetime property crime arrests for people between the ages of 15 to 25 when you were at your peak offending years, 16%. Compared to 11% for those in the low poverty voucher group had experienced a lifetime property crime arrest. All right. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. It is way too late to start this over at the level of the video. No, it's the number of times you've been arrested, 0.16 for those in high poverty neighborhoods, 0.11 for those in low poverty vouchers. When we go across like numbers and percentages and so on and so forth. It's sometimes hard. I sometimes am losing track here. But yeah, it seems generally the girls experienced an increase in their ability to make use of these neighborhoods. For boys, we see the exact opposite. We see generally the exact opposite. Boys ended up being generally more psychologically distressed than the girls did, and then whatever the mean was. But we did see that there was that the decrease for those in low poverty groups, the Z-score is a little bit closer to the mean. So if you're in one of these very high poverty neighborhoods, it does seem that the psychological distress that puts upon you is greater than it would be to be in a low poverty neighborhood. But those boys were more likely to use marijuana, more likely to have behavioral problems, and much more likely to have been arrested, right? 0.62 arrests compared to 0.47 arrests. So the behavioral problems, despite the beneficial psychological outcomes here, we simply are not seeing a major impact on the well-being of boys' behavior, which puts them in stark contrast to what is happening to the girls. Finally, and this was the big thing because moving to opportunity was conceptualized as a kind of an economic thing, a connection of people to economic and social assets. There was absolutely no change across the groups in likelihood of employment, lifetime earnings, yearly earnings or the likelihood of being on public assistance. If we just look, this graph here is showing the percentage of people that were employed. We can see that kind of goes up and down. The peak economic period of the 1990s was pretty good for everybody. There was a lot of labor market expansion. But the control group, the voucher group, and the low poverty voucher group generally move in lockstep with one another. So there was no impact of the neighborhood on the chances of being employed. There was no impact of the neighborhood of how much money you make. And there was no impact on how likely you were to be on public assistance, such as TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. Okay, so the quantitative evidence is very, very mixed. I can see that, all right, people generally did use the vouchers in a responsible way, and people generally did move to neighborhoods with lower rates of poverty. Teenage girls probably got a bit of a bump. Teenage boys probably ended up a little worse off. The adults, despite being a little bit healthier and despite being a little bit less distressed, not any more likely to be full participants of the labor market or the economy or to be making any more money. Later qualitative evidence adds a lot of nuance onto this. So the first thing we got was the quantitative follow-ups, which was through the surveys. Later on, scholars went into these neighborhoods and talked to the people that had actually experienced the move. And what we found is that there's a very, very big difference. And really, it is the crucial difference between leaving concentrated poverty and leaving poverty itself. So if I live in an area of concentrated poverty, that is bad for me. And then if I live in an area that does not have concentrated poverty, but I'm still impoverished, that's still a problem. That's still a problem. And so it leads me to believe, I'm going to say this again at length on Wednesday when you see my next lecture. Not that we're done with this, but when we see my next lecture, one of my feelings on this through the many years I spent trying to become an expert on neighborhoods and urban areas, my general attitude about social policy is to help poor people, not poor places. Okay? Because individual poverty is going to be with you even if the place isn't with you anymore. One of the major findings that emerged from all this qualitative evidence was that very few of the moving to opportunity families, and here I should specify, I'm talking specifically about the families that participated in the low poverty voucher program, very few of those MTO families developed substantive contact with their neighbors over an extended period of time. They just did not build the social network that they may have previously had in a very high poverty neighborhood. So yeah, they saw less drugs being sold, and yeah, they maybe saw less violence around them, and yeah, maybe they felt less psychologically distressed, but the social networks never recovered, okay? So what this finds is we know that neighborhoods create resources. We know that neighborhoods connect us to resources. Just moving to an area is not enough. Just moving to an area, it can still be very difficult to convert the area resources into my social resources. So one of the things I want you to think about is a little bit about who have you depended on in your life? There isn't a single person in this class, myself very much included, that has taken care of everything entirely on their own. And as you have grown up, right, as you went from being a little child to a teenager to now being a college student, you've probably slowly taken more and more responsibility for your own well-being and for the resources and things that you need in order to be happy, in order to be healthy, in order to be secure. But we never fully lose that reliance we have on resources and that reliance that we have on other people a little bit. And so in the same way that I encourage you to think about street gangs in Los Angeles as a response to a very degraded social opportunity structure, I want you to think about poor neighborhoods in which maybe people aren't doing anything illegal in the same way. It's not like people are dying and starving to death in those neighborhoods. They are living their lives. Those might be poor quality lives based on the way that you and I understand living a high quality life. But the networks that people create for themselves do give them the ability to make it in that environment. And so if you put people in a better area, but take away the network they previously had, that might end up being a wash at the end of the day. You might end up feeling like, yeah, I'm safer, but I am no more likely to convert like social capital and cultural capital into economic capital. Okay. And then when we look over the life course, we can see that there's one and really only one group of people that very much benefited from this. So we've looked at cohorts over the life course, especially if you were in Los Angeles, let's say in the moving to opportunity structure, and you moved in 1996 and stayed in that area, or you just spent your childhood in that area. Now it's 2020. We have decades of quantitative and qualitative evidence about how your life turned out and sort of what has gone on in your life over this time. And here's what's seen. This is very, very interesting to me. 13 years old, right when you become a teenager, that's the moment in which you either will or will not benefit from something like moving to opportunity. So children under the age of 13 that moved to a low poverty neighborhood, today those children are earning incomes on average a third greater than children who did not move in that experiment, in that control group. That's fascinating to me. If you moved under the age of 13, here's where it gets even more interesting. Children over the age of 13. So if you moved as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old, and you moved with your family to a low poverty neighborhood, you today are earning less than your peers in those high poverty areas that never moved. So the move might have ended up being worse for you than if you had just stayed in that neighborhood. Children can put their networks back together. Children are adaptable, far more than we give them credit for. But the older we get, the more stuck we get with our networks and the more stuck we get with the dependencies that exist in our lives. The researchers who have studied this, the economists and sociologists, generally believe, and it's way worse for boys, by the way, way worse for boys than it is for girls, because boys are more likely to act out in some very illegal ways. The older you get, just the more disruptive a move is. So what you're seeing on this graph here, it's the percentage gain from moving to a better area as the age of the child is when their parents move increases. So on the x-axis, that's age of child when parents moves. As you go from 10 to 15 to 20, you can see that there's a real decline in the percentage gains. And once you get into your 20s, there's almost no gain at all from going to a low poverty neighborhood. And emotionally and psychologically, I am absolutely sure that there is a gain. And I'm sure that the way the surveys and the data collection operated probably didn't do a great job at digging into the emotional effect of living in a better area. But economically speaking and legally speaking, it actually might have been somewhat disruptive. It actually might have put people somewhat worse off. So who benefited from this? Children, young children, because they were the most adaptable among us. So here's the big question. Can moving promote upward mobility? People like me would desperately like to believe that, who constantly rant and rave and rail about the opportunity structure of neighborhoods. Does it work? Does it promote upward social class mobility? I'm left with kind of a shoulder shrug. Kind of, sort of. 48% of the study absolutely ended up in an objectively better neighborhood than they were in before. So did that work? Yeah, I guess kind of. But the long-term benefits are somewhat muted. No more likely to be employed, no more likely to be on welfare, or to be off welfare, no more likely to be personally in poverty, even if they themselves are living in a low poverty area. So what this reminds me of, to really bring this kind of full circle here, what have I told you to think about constantly throughout this course? I want you to conceptualize cities as places of inequality. And that's very clear because we have high poverty and low poverty neighborhoods. And think of cities as networks. It's a network that can connect you to information. But what are those networks serving? Now let's theorize that even further downward into networks of survival and networks of mobility. The types of networks that might help you survive a poor area in a very disadvantaged, socially isolated neighborhood. That network might help you survive, but it also might sort of lock you personally into poverty throughout the rest of your life. And that's not the same as a network of mobility, a network that connects me to the opportunities that I need to actually improve my life. And so neighborhood effects, almost every time this gets studied in a quantitatively comprehensive way, neighborhood effects often don't have as much of an impact as we expect them to. And that personally makes me very sad because I want to believe investing in the neighborhood increases betters the life chances of the people that live in that neighborhood and have to make a living for themselves and have to take care of the people they're responsible for in those neighborhoods. But then I watched some of these documentaries about Detroit and South Central Los Angeles, and I realized that these networks are there. The networks exist, and they help people navigate the neighborhood that they're in. So the real question is not, can you just move people and get a better social outcome? The question is, once again, why do those neighborhoods exist in the first place? Question is not, does moving from a high poverty neighborhood to a low poverty neighborhood improve your life? The question is, why do high poverty, high concentrated, ghettoized neighborhoods even exist in the first place? When we think about social mobility, again, it's nothing like too often we ask the question about, what take something like educational outcomes and compare that to a country like Canada, which tends to score higher than we do on average in many things. The question is not, why do Canadians score better on tests? The question is, why is it easier to be poor in Canada than it is in the United States? And that's something that has not received nearly as much attention, within the educational realm of research. So did moving to opportunity work? I don't know. I'm kind of thinking I should have assigned a reaction paper on that. But I tell you, as a way of kind of figuring out who stayed with this video the whole way through, if you email me your thoughts about whether moving to opportunity worked and you write 2 to 3 sentences, I will be sure to attach a bonus point or two to whatever your average is currently in this course. Okay. If moving to opportunity isn't something that fixed our problems, the question becomes, what can? And that leads us into a very long discussion about social policy and what we can do at the governmental level and at the level of community policy in order to alleviate the problem of concentrated, ghettoized, minority-based poverty. And that is where I will pick up the next time that I see you. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to receiving your work. Thank you. Bye-bye.